My name is Russell Mefford. I was born in Florence, Alabama at ECM in 1968. I'm a jeweler, musician, and co-founder of the Fiddleworms. There was a song that came out with a movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It had raindrops on it, and I was obsessed with that song and played it so much I think my parents hid the little 45. I had one of those little record players, and I'd sit out in my garage and play it over and over and over again. And then after that, I fell in love with John Denver. Thought he was awesome. And my brother was a big Beatles fan, so that was the last thing in the world I wanted to do was like the Beatles. And then the Bee Gees came out with Sgt. Pepper, and I was going around bragging about how great these songs were. And my next door neighbor, Jimmy Jackson, told me, well, the Beatles wrote all those songs. So I became a Beatles fan, and they're probably my favorite band, though I like a whole lot of music. And at 15 years old, I started playing around on the guitar, and that's, I guess, when it started. I couldn't play other people's music very well, so I pretty much early on started writing my own songs. I met Waz. I had had a bad experience with a summer camp here in Alabama, and also I was 15 years old and dating a senior in high school, and so my parents were trying to get me out of town, you know. So my sister is a very accomplished whitewater paddlist. She worked for the NOC, so she was a guide on the Nantahala and the Ocoee, and she had observed that the paddlers from a camp called Mondamin, right outside of Hendersonville, that the paddlers were fantastic. So they sent me up there to learn how to paddle. And Jan Brand picked me up at the Greenville, South Carolina airport to drive me over to the camp. And on the way over, she asked me what I was into, and I was like, well, I just started playing guitar. I love music. And she was like, wow, well, there's a guy on the maintenance staff that's named Waz who's played with B.B. King and Jimi Hendrix. And so I never got in a boat. I hunted him down. Remember the first time I met him, I was coming back from my swim test, and he was emptying a trash can into a dumpster. And I just saw him. I just knew. I was like, that's Waz, you know. I was like, are you Waz? And he was like, yeah. I was like, have you ever made a record? And he was like, yeah, man, actually, I've done several records. And I was like, wow, that would just be, in my mind, that was like the most unattainable goal ever, you know. I was like, man, I would love to that would be incredible if I could ever make a record. And he said, well, you and I'll make one. That was like my first interaction with him. And he would come in, once the word got out that he was this great blues player, he would come in to morning assemblies, and he would have me play. And he really pushed me. He'd be like, all right, tomorrow you're going to play I've Just Seen a Face by the Beatles. And I'd be like, holy shit, man. So I'd sit up all night, you know, trying to figure it out. And so I ended up working at that camp while I was in college, and Waz worked there. And when I graduated from college, I moved to Tampa hoping to start a band with Waz. But he just had situations that it was not going to work out, you know, man, to be able to travel and play. And so my dad, he got bladder cancer, and I was like, man, I should come home. So I came home with that project in my pocket, idiotically, naively thinking that I would get some studio players, you know, to back me up, and we would go, you know, that's how green I was. Like, we'll go promote this project. So I was invited to a party by Charles Van Deventer. Charles had a great band called Stain Mecca, and had Matt Ross and Chris Quillen and Pat Thrasher in that band. And he invited me to a party over at Chris's girlfriend Lori's house. And they were celebrating. They had cut some songs over at UNA's studio for Brad Futrell. Hand of Pain is what they were calling it. And Patterson Hood was cutting like Pollyanna, what was it? He was cutting songs over there. So he was at that party, and we all sat around in a circle and just traded songs, just played songs in the round. The next Court Street Cafe gig I had, Chris showed up with his acoustic and sat in and played all night with me. And after the night ended, I gave him half my money, and I said, anytime you want to play with me. I am totally in. When I first ran into him, man, I was 16 years old, and my friend Chad Peden said, you're writing all these Beatles, Tom Petty type folk songs, and this guy's like the most awesome guitarist I've ever seen. I need to put you two together. And so we went out to Chris's house, his dad's house out in Kendale, and Carol had set up basically a studio down there with a drum set and amps, and I walked down with my acoustic, and I'm strumming Bob Dylan songs. And Chris, I don't think hardly ever looked up. He was just, he'd do a Cousin It thing where he'd fold his head over and his hair would come down all to totally cover his face. And he's there like ripping through Eruption and, Eddie Van Halen licks, and I'm, blowing in the wind. And we left, and I told Chad, I was like, man, I have nothing at all in common with that guy, Everybody told me when I first hooked up with him, like, you're not going to be able to depend on him, man. He's a great guy, but... and that was the farthest thing from the case for me, man. We would drive together to work in the morning. He would take my car, and he would go and put up flyers and do things, band-related, physically band-related things while I was at work, and then pick me up at 5, and we'd drive to wherever we were playing, man. And he never left me sitting on that corner, ever. And so that's kind of how we started playing together. And after several months of playing, he's like, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, I've got this project, and I'd like to put this band together, to support this project. And he was like, well, I'll put the band together for you. Johnny Sandlin came to see us over at the Tip Top, and he offered to record us. So again, I went back to Johnny's with the band this time. Johnny brought us over, we did a demo, he offered us a recording contract. He recommended that we have the contract looked at. I took the cassette tape and the contract over to Steve Backus, who's an attorney here in Tuscumbia. Steve was knocked out by it. He was like, how soon do you need to get back with him? And I was like, well, I don't want to leave him hanging. He's like, well, can you give me a week? I'd like to talk to some people in Nashville. Maybe we can get a deal, or Johnny produces, we do this whole thing. And I was like, cool. Yeah, sure, man. So I called the band, and everybody was in. I made a mistake. I should have called Johnny, but I didn't, man. And Jay, the keyboard player, started feeling guilty about it, and instead of calling and telling me about it, he called Johnny and told Johnny that I was having an attorney shop his tape around Nashville to get a deal. So all of a sudden, Steve Backus quits returning my phone calls. I'm like, what is going on, man? And so a couple of weeks go by, and we're at rehearsal, and Jay confesses to me that the reason you're not getting phone calls is I told Johnny about all this, and Johnny told me he called and threatened to sue Steve Backus for shopping the tape around. And so I was young, man. I was really mad. So I split the band up. I was like, if we're going to implode from the inside out, man, I'm out, man. And so Chris was like, well, are we going to keep playing? I was like, well, man, if you want to, yeah. And so we just played acoustic. We were in the filling station playing. Steve Backus comes in. I could tell he wanted to crawl underneath the table, man, when he saw us in there, but he didn't leave. And after we played a set, I went over and sat down right by him, and he was like, so are y'all recording a record with Johnny Sandlin? I was like, we're not recording a record with anybody, man, And he's like, well, if you want me to, I can call Rodney Good and Harold Shedd's son, Mitch Shedd, up in Nashville. They have Revolution Studio up on Music Row, and have them come down and listen and see if they're interested. And I was like, man, just don't pull my chain, man. I was like, if you want to do that, great. And if you don't, it's cool. And sure enough, he called them, and they came down and saw us at the corner in Huntsville. And then they brought us up to record, to try to get a record deal. So we recorded Yellowhammer over 6 days. We went up 3 days, I think, in early June, and then maybe the following November. I can't remember. It's inside the liner notes. But it was originally supposed to be a demo to try to get a record deal. So we kept playing and booking gigs, and then they were shopping that tape around, and we had interest from several record labels. One in particular, Polygram Records, was interested in us, and they were saying they were going to send people out to see us. So we sent them a list of shows that we had, like, okay, we're going to be in Florence for Memorial Day weekend here. We're going to be at City Stages. We're going to be at City Fest. We're going to be down in New Orleans here. And they originally said that they were going to come see us play at the Memorial Show in Florence. And so Hester Cope from Main Street was on me about a press release for the show. And so I called Bacchus and I was like, man, are you sure they're coming? You know, man. He was like, yeah, they say they're coming, man. And so it was in the paper that Polygram Records was coming to see us play. And then the day before they called and they're like, hey, man, we're not going to be able to make the Florence show, but we will definitely either be at City Stages or City Fest. And then, of course, that night Chris passed away in an automobile accident. And we just kept playing. You know, I don't know how much y'all want to know about that, or we just kept playing. We without a guitar player, you know. And one night at rehearsal, Scott Kennedy, Wolf, walks in with Rob Malone. And Rob's like, I want to do it. And he really helped us heal. Rob is a completely beautiful but different guitar player than Chris was. And he took a lot of arrows because we had a demo and we wanted to go ahead and release it, just if not anything else, so people could hear Chris and what he was about. So we went out playing those songs, and people would come up to Rob and be like, "You're playing it wrong. You know, that's not." And Rob and Chris were close too, or that's not the way Chris would have played it, you know. But if he had tried to copy what Chris was doing, it would have been horrible, man. So what he did was really beautiful for us, you know. And so we released the Yellowhammer record. We started getting some pretty good gigs, man. We got to play at the side stage of when Santana played Oak Mountain. They just released that side stage, so we got to play before Santana and after Santana, which was great. And we got to play on the same stage when the Allman Brothers came through there, and we got to open for Government Mule over at 5 Points Music Hall, and Colonel Bruce, back when Chris was alive, Colonel Bruce took a liking to us, and we probably played shows with him 8 or 9 times over our career. He was really generous to try to bring in local bands when he was playing. But Ronnie Knight, who builds Blue South guitars, we had just by accident, you know, Ronnie was building prototypes of Blue South upstairs above Pegasus when we were rehearsing, getting started. And when we got asked to go over and record at Johnny Sandlin's, he lent me a prototype of a Macon that he had built. And we went over, and Johnny Sandlin and Chris, they A-B'd it against Chris's Les Paul, and they ended up using the Blue South on everything. And then Johnny picked up the phone and called Warren Haynes and Alan Woody, and they ended up having Ronnie make instruments for them. So it was just lucky for me just to be in that spot. But Ronnie and I became dear friends, and he gave me Jerry Wexler's address and asked me to mail a copy of Yellowhammer to him. And so, man, it was awesome. I was coming back from lunch one day, and my brother, who's really a big reason why I play music, because he loves music so much, but he couldn't stand it, because, I mean, he had to deal with me being late, you know, man. He had to deal with a bunch of nonsense. But to walk in at lunch and Owen go, Russell, Jerry Wexler's on line 1 for you. I was like, far out, man. And he was like, well, what you're doing is interesting, man. He was like, I'm going to pass it along to someone over at Capricorn and someone over at Atlantic, and you may or may not hear from them, but here's my Florida address and phone number. Here's my New York address and phone number. And then about a week later, I got a call from Phil Walden, and he said, he's like, I think we're going to pass. He was like, I'm not sure. And then went to rehearsal, and I just think the enormity of just, there wasn't ever really a lot of release after Chris passed away. We just kind of kept going, you know. And Chris touched a lot of people. A lot of people understandably loved him. And so Rob was just like, I just can't do it, man, you know. can't do this. And so I went to Bacchus because he bought the ugly orange limousine we used to ride around in. He bought our PA. We had a per diem when we recorded in Nashville that he would, do. And he was like, tell Rob, and Rob formed a little three-piece. I think Nathan James was in that band called Nine Bullets. You'd have to ask them, but he was just kicking around town doing that. And so Bacchus said, well, tell Rob I'll fund both projects. I'll fund the Fiddleworms and I'll fund Nine Bullets, and whatever happens is okay, But Rob's not that kind of cat, man. He didn't want to do that. So he kicked around, and then I guess 4 or 6 months later, he moved to Athens and joined the Truckers. So at that point, Mitch Mann came on the scene, and my mom got sick. And probably the only time in my life that it was the right thing to come home, but I felt like I need to get serious, I need to, I love making jewelry. It's been in my family since, 1911. There's been somebody in a jewelry store in Florence, So I have a love for that. It definitely doesn't exceed my love for music, but I have a love for jewelry. And so I amicably said, well, let's shut it down, man. And sometime in the mid-2000s, I get a call from Mitch Mann, and he said, hey, James LeBlanc is leaving Rodney Good's band. Would you mind calling and seeing if they're looking for a guitar player? And so I called Rodney. I hadn't talked to him in 8 years, man. And I was like, hey, man, I heard James is leaving the band, and if y'all are looking for a guitar player. And he was like, no, I don't know what we're going to do about that. He was like, but I still got those initial recordings we did with Rob. You want to come and finish that record? So I got on the phone, and I called. Chalmers was over in Jackson, Mississippi. Rob was still living in Athens. And of course, Mitch and I continued to play acoustic together through that time. And Matt and Scott had moved to Huntsville and joined a band with Mike Roberts called 5 O'Clock Charlie. So we all went up to Nashville and finished that record. And that's kind of how the Fiddleworms got back together after that hiatus. And I didn't know what to call the record, so I was sitting at a Chinese restaurant called the Peking over in Florence. And they had that kind of Chinese zodiac menu. And I was like, wow, well, I'm 60, I'm the monkey, I was like, well, I wonder what Chris is. And I looked, and he was the cock. So I was like, we got to call the record You're the Cock, man.
So, great title.
But my wife was totally against it at the time. And then it turned out, it took longer than expected to mix the record. I'm always wanting to get stuff done. Like, let's get it done. Let's get moving. And I wanted to get that record out as soon as possible. It turned out it was going to be the following year before it came out. And so I went over and played it for Dick Cooper, and he liked it, and he offered to road manage us. And he's like, what are you calling it? And I said, You're the Cock. And he's like, I'm You're the Cock. I was like, far out, man. He said, and guess what next year is? I was like, what? And he said, You're the Cock.
Can you tell us about working with Donnie Fritz?
Yeah, man. So my dad had that same place out on Shoal Creek. He was letting me stay out there. And Scott Boyer had a house nearby there. And we would always, and Dick Cooper had a house over there too. And so one evening, Scott Boyer was like, hey man, why don't you and I write a song together sometime? And I had always wanted to, but I never had the guts to ask him. And so he and I got together and we wrote a song called Don't Shoot the Prophet. And at the same time, Waz was doing some kind of Graham Parsons tribute down in Tampa. And we brought in a Will Corey and Sheenan Cole, and Daniel Ledford took photographs, and they came in and filmed us over at the Nut House, and we did a couple covers of Graham Parsons and did Don't Shoot the Prophet. And at that shoot, he said, "Hey man, why don't we get together and try to write another one on Monday, and would it be okay if I asked Donnie to come along?" I was like, yeah, that'd be great. Sure. Trying not to pee on myself. So then, we go to eat first. With Donnie, you go to eat. So we went to the Killen Diner, had some breakfast, and then walked into Scott's had a little studio in his living room, and Donnie sat down and played basically the first verse and chorus of a song called I Need a Change. And basically Scott and I tossed in lyrics ideas, maybe a chord change here or there, but it was basically a Donnie Fritz song that we got to add onto. And then when we did the Fiddleworms See the Light record, we included that song on the record, and Donnie and Scott came in and sang with me on it, which was awesome. And Donnie, he was a lover. As talented as he was, he also loved music. Like, you can probably ask almost any Muscle Shoals artist that's playing here locally that it was very rare that you played a show and looked out and didn't see Donnie Fritz sitting at a table watching and supporting an amazing guy. The Muscle Shoals meets. Yeah, man, so a little over 9 years ago, in November 7th, it'll be 10 years since I've reopened the family business. So this was a little over 9 years ago. I just reopened the store. And within 2 days, Earl McGuire from the Healing Place and then Lance and Beth Howard from Room in the Inn came in. They said, hey, they both said the same thing, basically. They were like, we would like to hire the Fiddleworms to play a benefit for our charity. And I told him, I was like, well, this is a perfect situation for me because I've just reopened my family. I don't have any money, man. I was like, but I can give you my time. I was like, but I've got to pay everybody else. And I was like, I don't want to do that taking money out of your pocket, or it would defeat the whole purpose of having a benefit. And I was like, I'm a huge Beatles freak. This needs to be more than just us on a Saturday night. I've got the DVD of when the Beatles played the Sullivan Theater on February 9th of '64. It's got all those old commercials. I was like, maybe we could show some of those old commercials and try to recreate that environment, and then we would come out and play some Beatles covers. But I never had any idea how to finance it. So a year and a half later, when Outback was still here in Sheffield, I was getting drunk at the bar at Outback, and a guy who owns a car dealership named Mike Miller just walks up to me out of the blue and says, hey man, the Velcro Pygmies want me to sponsor a show for them. Do you have got any ideas for a show? I was like, man, I've had a show in my head for like a year and a half. If you don't mind me asking, how much money do they want? He's like, well, they want $3,500 from me and $3,500 from Mark Blackburn over at CVNS Bank. I was like, shit, man, I think I could put on a pretty cool show for that. But we had both been drinking, so I didn't act on it. A couple weeks later, I run into him again at the bar, and he's like, hey, man, are you working on that show? And I was like, well, I am now, man. So I called up Charles Rose and Harvey Thompson, and we set up to recreate. They played with John Lennon on his last public performance when they were touring with Elton John on Thanksgiving of '79. I can't remember when it was, '77 maybe. But so we reprised the songs that he did with them, with those horns. We lucked out that Jimmy Hall was available from Wet Willie, and he came and did Wilson Pickett's version of Hey Jude. I had Jerry Phillips sing a Carl Perkins tune that his dad had recorded that the Beatles had covered. And so it just kind of fell together. But it was funny, man. I called the charities up. I was like, man, I got great news. Like, the show is going to happen. We raised $7,000. And they were like, man, that's fabulous. What did you do with it? And I was like, well, I spent it. And they were like, well, that's not normally how you do this sort of thing. And I was like, well, I'll be honest with you. I don't know what I'm doing, man. I was like, but in order to book this show, I have to, that's the only way I knew to do it. But I did lay in bed before that show thinking, oh, man, what if we only, because you know how this town is. Like, we're so spoiled here with all the great music that it's not a guarantee that people are going to be able to come out, So I was worried that I had spent $7,000 and was going to raise $500 or something, but it worked. It worked. The show sold out. We raised over $11,000 for each of the charities, paid 15 musicians, for the night, and had a lot of fun. So it kind of took a life of its own. The next year we did Muscle Shoals meets the Stones. Then on February the 27th of 2020, we did Muscle Shoals meets Sam Phillips. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, the whole world shut down. And so we were able to not miss a year. So in 2021, in June, we did Muscle Shoals meets Tom Petty. And then the next year, we did Muscle Shoals meets the Swampers. And then last year, we did Muscle Shoals meets the Eagles. And over the 6 years, we've raised over $115,000 for the Healing Place. I don't have numbers for Room at the Inn. They bowed out after the Swampers show, so it all went to the Healing Place last year. I call this place my hometown, and when I say my hometown, I was born and raised and went to school in Florence, and my business is in Florence, but I consider my hometown the whole Quad Cities, like we're one big community in my humble opinion. So when we decided to go this direction of doing something for special needs, I was like, if we build something, we can't build something on one side of the river. If we build it on one side, whatever we do on one side of the river, we need to do equally on the other side of the river. So I went and met with the folks at Muscle Shoals, asked them what they needed the most. They said they needed a special needs playground at the middle school. So I was like, get me drawings and a quote. And then I went and met with Becky Odell over in Florence, who's over the special needs on the Florence program, and asked her what she needed the most. And she said they needed a special needs playground at the high school. It's like, wow, man. So got drawings and a quote, and we bounced around venues for a minute, but then when we settled on the Shoals Theater, I realized that, if we sell out both nights, which it looks like we're going to, so I divided the first night up into 10-seat sections and went around with the drawings of the playgrounds and talking about what we were trying to do. And we sold those sections for $10,000 a section. And we had some $5,000 sections, a little off on the wings, and some $2,500 sections. Before we sold a ticket, man, we raised over $130,000.
Awesome.
So we're going to build some fucking playgrounds, man.